writes for several blogs, including www.leadingagile.com. And over to Mike.
Hey everybody, appreciate you guys joining me today. We've got a ton of people that are going to join us for this talk today, and it looks like everybody's trickling in fast. So you know, I've also got a ton of ideas that I want to try to get off to you guys. So the title of the talk, blending Scrum and Kanban to create an end-to-end agile enterprise. You know, it's something that you can write books about and such. And we've got 40 minutes. So what I'm really going to try to do is to introduce just a ton of ideas and paint as complete a picture as I possibly can for everyone about what I'm talking about here. Hold on a minute. There we go. Okay, cool. This talk, the genesis of this really goes back about 7 or 8 years to some work that I was doing with a company here in Atlanta called CheckFree. And what we were doing is we were implementing Scrum and extreme programming at the team level. And I actually had the responsibility for doing what you might consider kind of like the program management aspect of this, and even to some degree kind of the portfolio management aspects of it. And back in the day, what we were doing is we had drawn a lot out of David Anderson's work in the Agile Management book around the theory of constraints and applying theory of constraints to Agile management. And over the years, David's thinking on this has kind of emerged into Kanban, and I went out and left that particular company and was a consultant for version 1 for a little while, and I've been out on my own for a while applying these ideas. What I think we found here is a pattern that works. So what I'm giving you guys today is not really a prescriptive formula, as I think you had might see, but it's more a way of thinking about introducing these concepts into an organization and creating a system where the entire organization kind of functions in an agile way, rather than just maybe in any individual Scrum team functioning in an agile way. So there's my contact information on the screen. Hope everybody can see that, and that's a picture of me up there. I'm a little better shaven today. So let's talk about our agenda for the next few minutes. So first thing I want to do is I want to talk about why I spend so much time talking about Scrum, Kanban in the enterprise. Why isn't Scrum just enough? A lot of folks, they've gotten introduced to Scrum. They might have taken their CSM training. Why can't I apply this everywhere? It's a great methodology. We want to talk a little bit about why we need some other things and what those other things might look like. The other thing that I want to talk about right after this is what end-to-end business agility looks like and how it's different from team-level agility, and why team-level agility isn't enough. I want to explore one adoption and transformation strategy and maybe a few alternatives. This is kind of a little bit of a case study around one particular company that I'm working with and another one that we're just getting started, and some of the issues those guys are having. So I'm kind of abstracting that out and blending some ideas a little bit. And then last but not least, I want to show how to manage the flow of value across the enterprise using ultimately Scrum at the team level and then Kanban at the program and portfolio level. So first agenda item, why not just Scrum? So if you think about it, I think we're all here, we all understand Agile. Scrum is primarily a team-based approach for delivering products. You could say it's a team-based approach for delivering projects. What have you, it kind of depends on your worldview. But at the end of the day, it is a methodology that is largely focused on this idea of 5 to 9, I guess, what do they say, 7 plus or minus 2 people that are all working together. They're delivering on a cadence, and at the end of every sprint, we deliver an increment of working product, whatever that is. One of the key things in Scrum is that the team needs to have everything that it needs to deliver an increment of that product. And so the team has developers, and we have testers, and we have analysts, and maybe we have a Scrum master. In order for Scrum to work, we almost absolutely have to have a product owner. I should probably even take the almost out. Having somebody play that role is pretty key, and it's pretty common failure mode within Scrum. But Scrum's a great methodology if you have that. And really kind of the operating principle here is that the team has everything that it needs to deliver an increment of working, tested, software in my domain, but I could more generalize that out to a product. So the first question you ask when you talk about doing Scrum at scale is you say, well, what if my team is more than this 5 to 9, I guess is probably what I should have put on that slide, more than the 5 to 9 people that make up a Scrum team. I kind of think of two patterns, and I'm sure there's probably more, but the two that I encounter the most are the two that we're getting ready to go over here. So this first one is what I call like Scrum in the enterprise, and the word in is the operative word. So I've got my Scrum team, but with regard to the larger organization, the Scrum team is really the only thing that is Agile in the organization. So this Scrum team is surrounded by a cloud of stakeholders. And so from the team's perspective, the team may very well have everything that it needs to be successful. But to some extent, there's this cloud of stakeholders around them. And so from a Scrum team's point of view, there might be, an operations team, or there might be a marketing team or a sales team, or maybe there's even some other development team at some point that they have to interact with. So when we're talking about this single Scrum team, we have a certain set of issues. So we're kind of focused on making sure that the team performs well and communicating out into the broader organization what the Scrum team's doing and how it measures progress and how it makes and meets commitments and all that kind of stuff. So Scrum in the enterprise I define as one or more Scrum teams, and it doesn't have to be just one. It could be a bunch of Scrum teams in a larger, largely non-Agile organization. And we're not really trying to make the organization Agile. We're trying to just make sure that these Scrum teams are successful doing what they do. The next thing is a little play on words here a little bit. Is rather than Scrum in the enterprise, now we're talking about enterprise Scrum. So now what we're saying is okay, well, we realize that just having little pockets of Scrum is probably not getting us the overall business agility that we hope for. So now what we want to have is we want to have this end-to-end Scrum model. And so the way that I've seen this taught by some of the various CSTs I know. I actually heard Ken Schwaber describe this pattern, I want to say back at Agile 2007, DC maybe, I think where Agile 2007 was. And he talked about this idea of enterprise Scrum. So let's talk about what that is. So enterprise Scrum, clearly different from Scrum in the enterprise. Now we're talking about not just a single Scrum team or multiple Scrum teams kind of operating within this cloud. We're talking about multiple Scrum teams operating in a more coordinated fashion. So you can almost think about this, I could have probably drawn this as concentric circles if I wanted to, as any number of Scrum teams that are encapsulated by a Scrums or some sort of product team, something like that. Then those collections of product teams are encapsulated by the organization. And what is unique about this particular scaling pattern is that every single one of those teams or those kind of encapsulated entities has everything that it needs to deliver an increment of product. So the teams at the lowest level can release product into market. The teams, the encapsulation teams, kind of the product teams, those can potentially release at any time. The entire organization can potentially release at any time. And if you notice what's happening here is that what they're doing in this particular structure is really reducing a ton of dependency management across the organization by making every single team an autonomous unit. Then it makes the management complexity go way down. Perfectly candid, if I were building an organization from absolute scratch, this is probably somewhere close to the model that I would follow. I mean, I think it's a very efficient business model. I think would work. I think there's a lot of case studies where this kind of a pattern works out in industry. So the challenge is that now we go into our existing organizations and we try to apply this pattern, and what happens is that this pattern confronts with existing structures and existing management and existing just norms, delivery patterns, business models, corporate objectives, and investments, all kinds of different things. And so when you talk about introducing Scrum in an enterprise way like this, one of the challenges that you have is that it's not just about going in and helping teams adopt Agile. You can come in and do some training, a little bit of coaching, get a team reasonably functioning well. But what you're really looking at is an enterprise transformation event where there's a lot of stuff, all the way from, again, right, how marketing and sales handles things, all the way to the backside, how support's being handled, HR policies, all that kind of stuff. So if this is a pattern that you're going for, just realize that is a pretty significant transformation event. But that said, I mean, if you could pull something like this off, that's pretty cool. So we can kind of leave that at that. So let's talk about the stuff that we see quite a lot that breaks Scrum. We've alluded to some of this a little bit. So the first thing that I think really breaks Scrum is this idea of external dependencies. So we see dependencies a lot. When I go in and train and coach, especially project managers, I consider myself a project manager at the core. And, project managers, I think we're just kind of wired to track dependencies. And so how do we track dependencies? How do we manage dependencies? How do we get everything on the same page? Well, what Scrum largely tries to do is it says, let's try to break dependencies first. And I'm all for breaking dependencies where we can, because we want to manage as few of those as we have to. But in certain organizations, dependencies are kind of a fact of life. We've got this cloud around us, and we might have certain specialized resources, a lot of times like a DBA or a UX designer, or maybe we have a subject matter expert that has to be shared across multiple teams, or maybe the ability to do configuration management and build environments and things like that lives outside the team. Maybe our Scrum team has some external dependencies on the marketing department feeding it certain things for the UI or the branding and such. So anytime you have external dependencies in Scrum, that is something to kind of pay attention to, because dependencies matter, because if the team's velocity, the rate at which they can complete work, is dependent upon something outside the team, that makes it very difficult to establish a stable velocity. And so what teams try to do is they try to kind of manage those dependencies, right, and plan for them in advance. Well, the more dependencies that we try to manage for and plan in advance, what we end up doing is reducing our agility even at the team level, because we've got to kind of forward look a little bit too far. And the more things our forward look is connected to, the harder it is to inspect and adapt as we go. And so excessive forward planning can reduce our ability to change as we learn new things. And then what I think is the more insidious of this is that lack of full ownership can result in a lack of commitment, and then even sometimes unreliable results. So that's the first thing. So external dependencies to me are a really big flag that Scrum might have some issues in my organization. The other issue that I encounter quite a bit, and it's funny, there's a gentleman, he might actually be on the phone, he's a guy named Brian Sondergaard, who I worked with at CheckFree, now Fiserv. We would wrestle over this idea of how does Scrum fit into an organization where you, in effect, have many-to-many relationships all over the place. So let me explain that a little bit. So I've got this idea of my team. I've got multiple teams, right? Kind of same structure that we talked about when we talked about scaling Agile. We might have, even in an Agile environment, we might have some sort of product team or some sort of encapsulation mechanism, or at least what we'd hope would be an encapsulation mechanism, some sort of maybe portfolio layer that's kind of taking more of a business view of all this kind of stuff. But what's interesting in this many-to-many relationship environment is that each delivery capability kind of at the higher level relies on multiple Scrum teams underneath it. And what the net effect is that these higher order entities are feeding things into the various Scrum teams' backlog, ideally through the product owner. But what tends to happen is that in these many-to-many organizations, team velocity isn't a predictor of those higher order deliverables. So at the lowest level, all of those teams could be establishing stable velocity. The velocity could be increasing. It could be hyper-productive. But if it requires all four of those teams to come together to deliver something, or it requires all of those teams to work in coordination, now what we have to have is we have to have all of our backlogs sequenced and all that kind of stuff. And then, again, if we've got multiple entities feeding into those teams, it's very easy for one team to maybe get focused on one set of customers and one set of deliverables and starve the other part of the organization's ability to create value. So what we end up, in effect, having is kind of a constraint. And so ideally what we want is our team's velocity to be a great predictor of the higher order deliverables. And in these kinds of environments where you have shared services. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about what the kinds of environments are. So let's say we have a suite of products that we want to bring to market. So maybe 6 independent products that all have to come together to deliver an integrated deliverable. And there's multiple ways that these things interconnect. So if we're not in alignment on those things, the team performance isn't an indicator of other performance. Other areas where this comes in, when you have like a component-based architectural model, that kind of stuff, or where you have like a shared services model or services-oriented architecture, one or more teams can starve the value creation process. And so what happens in this particular case is that you have to do really massive level release planning. Backlogs have to be sequenced. Dependencies have to be coordinated in the backlog. All that stuff has to show up at the same time. And again, if anybody's off, it just all those dependencies reduce our business agility. Teams focus on their backlog often to the exclusion of the rest of the organization. So when I talk about end-to-end business agility, what I'm fundamentally talking about is, this is kind of the Scrum model. What we want is we want the benefits of team-level agility, but we want them across the entire company. So just like a team can work off of a prioritized backlog, be able to deliver an increment of working software, look at it, get feedback from it, feed that in, adapt, and we can change, we want the enterprise to be able to do that. Now, that might not be on a 2-week cadence, depending upon your enterprise, but it might be able to be on a 6-week cadence or on a quarterly cadence. So we want rapid feedback. We want everybody on the same page. We want to be able to put something in market, or at least to do an internal delivery, be able to look at it and be able to take feedback. We actually want a pattern that can accommodate sales and marketing. So we want the front side to be covered. So if the development teams are not being fed appropriately by strategy, or sales is pushing too many things into the pipe and overloading the organization's ability to deliver, that's a problem. So we want to be able to accommodate that on the front side and understand how that entire system works. We want to be able to deal with projects that are going to require multiple Scrum teams, or environments that have like a services orientation, or like a shared services or a component model architecture. We also want to be able to handle technical support and ultimately sustaining and engineering. And so we've got all these pieces that have to come into play, but we don't want to get them all coordinated with a big upfront plan, but yet we need kind of everybody focused on the same stuff at the same time, or else it just gets messed up, right? So the trick is to figure out how to do all this stuff without coming up with kind of the big upfront plan that limits our ability to change over time. And so a couple years ago, I wrote this in a blog post that I did. But regardless of how much you think of Scrum and how much you think of its general applicability, I would suggest that at some level of scale, Scrum is going to break. And it might be a level of scale that's large, hundreds of people, where we've got hardware and firmware and business logic and data warehouses and presentation and stuff like that across hundreds of people. At some point that it's going to break. And so what we have to figure out is what we're going to do about it, and ask ourselves if we have a credible strategy to be able to handle it when just a single Scrum team isn't enough. And so I'm going to put up a very controversial list of tools that I think that are available to scale Scrum. And if I've got some folks on the table or on the call, you guys might say, well, at the point you do this, Mike, you're not doing Scrum anymore. And I'm like, I'm okay with that. I think Scrum, again, is great at the team level, and that's typically what I teach and coach at the team level. But at the enterprise level, unless I can really make a solid transformation plan, that's where people want to go, we're going to bring in some other things. So the base of this is almost always Scrum and extreme programming. We start to introduce some ideas from Kanban. Tons of material today, so I hope everybody on the phone is familiar, at least to some degree, with Kanban or the basics of Kanban, because I'm not going to get into too much of the hows or whys. You'll get a little bit of a feel for it towards the end of the talk. We're going to talk about Lean. We're going to talk about, understanding the value streams, and we're going to talk about reducing waste and, eliminating latency and increasing cycle time and all that kind of stuff. Those are helpful to us. Nasty word in the Agile community sometimes with rational unified process. Maybe I could have taken the R off of it and called it unified process, made it a little bit more palatable. But there's some really excellent ideas around risk mitigation and how you phase projects and how you think about where large complex projects are at in their life cycle and route. And so I don't want to throw that out. There's a couple ideas that I want to use. And then occasionally we're gonna introduce some concepts from a traditional SDLC, because at times, things have to be done with some analysis, design, build, test, deploy, that kind of a thing. And so if that's an applicable tool to help us understand where certain higher level items are and their flow, we're going to leverage those things. So okay, Mike, you've been talking for about 20 minutes now. You've laid out the idea, maybe why we might want to consider some other things beyond Scrum. Maybe we realize that we don't want to transform our entire organization right away, or maybe never. So how do we get there? And so I don't think that there's any easy answers to this, and this is an absolutely a hard, difficult problem. Even if you get buy-in at the senior levels to come do this, I mean, there's still you got to introduce it, you got to change culture, you got to do some different things. So it falls into the category of non-trivial problems. But from my point of view, if we're going to do Agile, it always starts with teams. And you might be a really big Kanban enthusiast, and you say, hey, Mike, when you use Kanban, maybe you don't have to have Agile teams in that same way. And I would agree with you, right? We could have a more extended conversation about this. But for me personally, it always starts with teams. So what I want to do is I want to look for those objects in the organization that enable me to create teams. And you kind of ask yourself, well, why does it always start with teams for you, Mike? Because there's this beauty associated with people getting together, working together, having shared accountability, being empowered, being self-organized to some degree, and it just creates a dynamic within that group of people that really creates high performance. And so I love the idea of teams that have everything that they need to deliver an increment of value. But again, right, we're realizing that this increment of value is a bit of a squishy expression. So one of the first things you want to do is look at the things within your organization that you can organize teams around that give you the greatest chance of being successful. And so some of the things that would make sense are products. I mean, Scrum's got that one nailed. Product features, right? So we might have collections of features within a larger product that we want to look at. This is the one that's a little bit controversial, but almost always necessitates this kind of approach as a component-based architecture. Now, again, right, I'm not talking about components in the small in terms of like, single team components within a small product. I'm talking about large-scale enterprise architecture where I've got, data warehousing and web services and presentation and various things that are really, it's almost like products of products when you get to that level of scale. Each of the components within the infrastructure are really products in themselves. Shared services, model services-oriented architecture, where you have a collection of services that satisfy a certain need, but you've got multiple customers or channels that are placing demands on that particular service and need that service to evolve. And then also another area is this idea of business capabilities. So there might be some object within the business that we want to consider organizing a team around that's supported by technology. Okay, so products, features, components, shared services, and business capabilities. And once you've kind of defined that org structure and you understand what those objects are that you ultimately want to organize teams around, what you want to do is you want to form the teams, right? And we're going to do this incrementally. I don't know that you would do every single one of them all at the same time, although if you could, that might be neat. And then we're going to get the teams delivering. So right out of the gate, before we have a fully formed backlog that's operating in this way, we want to get the team starting to establish a stable velocity. Because one of the big things, I've often joked that I think that the one thing that separates Agile from total chaos sometimes is the fact that the teams make and meet commitments every 2 weeks. They deliver working software every 2 weeks, and that there is a stable delivery cadence and hopefully a stable velocity, or maybe even an increasing velocity over time. So getting the teams working together, getting them functioning as a unit, and getting them delivering and to where we can measure them is a huge thing right out of the gate. And so even while we're doing all this other stuff, we've got to get those teams going. As I mentioned, focus on establishing a stable velocity, and then learn what works. So we don't want to, if we flip the switch overnight, we just got to realize that a lot of times with this, it's almost like sculpting, as I imagine. I'm not a sculptor myself, but you start off with this big block of clay, right, and you're shaping it over time until it looks like something beautiful. And so what we know is the first pass is never going to be as good as the second pass or the third pass or the fourth pass. So there's this continuous improvement aspect. So introduce teams, introduce a couple of teams, learn what works, learn what doesn't, and then roll that out horizontally across the organization. So incrementally roll out Scrum across the organization. And then establish maybe program teams or product integration teams, things that are going to, in effect, encapsulate this. I wish I had like a whole hour to talk about this one concept. But very often I talk about this idea of product owner teams to be able to take product vision and do the story mapping and to do the initial decomposition and to wrestle down some of the higher, stickier architectural issues that span different teams. And then they kind of collectively, in effect, form kind of a product council or something for the teams that are up underneath them. So we start looking for structures within the organization where it makes sense to have like appropriate aggregate points, and then kind of a portfolio planning at the top. And so I've done this several times with companies over the last year, and it's interesting, the introduction pattern is different. And like using this example as a base, like the two teams at the bottom on the left, we might implement those and then implement that middle tier and then go over and implement the other two and then its middle tier and then integrate them kind of with a whole portfolio planning thing around them. Sometimes you might go all the way across the bottom, all the way across the middle, all the way across the top. But there is an element of top-down design. You want to understand how your organization is going to function. You want to understand what your organization's architecture looks like. And then you want to incrementally introduce those pieces into the enterprise. And importantly, because we know that we're really fundamentally trying to solve a dependency management problem and a many-to-many relationship problem, we want to manage the flow of value at each level. Now that's the interesting thing, and so this is, if you haven't caught it, this is the place where the talk kind of inflects a little bit. So if you look at those three layers that I've got on the diagram, at the bottom layer we care about velocity. That's what the team is working on. And so we want the team to be hyper productive. We want their velocity to be increasing. We want all the good Scrum stuff that we talk about. But what we're acknowledging is that the backlogs that drive those Scrum teams are coming from multiple sources. There's two teams that are up above the Scrum teams. And because they're feeding them in unpredictable ways, potentially, the velocity at the team level does not necessarily indicate a velocity at the middle tier level. So if I were doing velocity and tracking velocity at the middle tier level, I might have kind of some indications of like maybe a team that's not fully dedicated to a particular backlog. So we're going to see velocity go up and down, and we're going to see the burn down being erratic, and even more so at the top layer. But what that tells me is that at that horizontal layer and the top layer, where I really care about enterprise value, things that I'm actually going to put in the market and give to a customer, even though I'm predictable at the bottom, I'm not necessarily predictable at the top. And therein lies the problem. When I was out doing consulting for the last couple of years, I would inevitably walk into these organizations and pockets of Scrum that are doing great and pockets of Scrum that aren't, but there's not really a great way to manage across. And so we don't want to let one team starve the whole value creation process. So what does it look like when I'm done? Well, what it looks like when I'm done is that we want an enterprise, an end-to-end enterprise that is focused 100% on delivering value across the entire value stream, across the entire organization. And this was a great quote from a CTO that I was working with as we were implementing this in his organization. He said, if all we do is find another way to measure activity, we're not going to be successful. And this is the hard pill to swallow, is at the team level, the user stories, even though they're valuable and they increment the product and all the good rules of Agile, at the team level, that looks like activity to the CTO. What the CTO cares about, or the CIO, or whoever it is in your organization, CEO, what they care about are when all those little pieces come together and deliver features that can be touched and felt by an actual customer, or maybe even an epic, like once we get a major release or something out into the market. So what we want to do is we want to make sure we're not just tracking activities. So I'll go in and start talking about this. Now I'm going to get really tactical with you guys for just a minute and start talking about how to map and track value. And now we're going to start anchoring into some concepts that you've probably heard if you've been in and around the Agile community for any length of time. So, this is a little bit of an arbitrary distinction. I'm starting to see some people writing about this particular kind of three-tiered kind of mapping. I tend to standardize on this idea of epics being collections of features, 1 to 3 months. They're kind of big. Maybe they span releases. We have the idea of features that are maybe smaller than epics, typically 2 to 4 weeks. Ideally, features are contained within a team, but they could be things that span different teams, stuff that the product owner is really driving into the product. User stories being the smallest increment of value, typically less than a week. What do we say, about 1 to 3 days, something like that. User stories are always contained within a sprint. So there's this relationship basically between big stuff, medium stuff, and small stuff. So we have this vision for the organization where we want to take it. We want to map out through various, it might be release planning in your organization, various constructs. We're going to understand how value is created. And we want the ability to be able to demonstrate that visually. So business value, the things the organization cares about, decomposed into smaller and smaller pieces that ultimately make the team's backlog. So forgive me here just a little bit, run through this animation. So we got the epics breaking down the features. We got the user stories being decomposed. Teams can do their estimates at the user story level. Estimates roll up, ultimately roll up into the size of an epic. One of the big wins of Agile, by doing some of this decomposition, it helps us understand how we can thin out what we need to do to deliver the value in the epic. So we introduced the idea of the minimally marketable feature. So we're looking always for the smallest subset that can be delivered into the product to be able to get what we need and to be able to deliver business value early. So now, given that we've now put the user story into a broader business context, I'm going to walk through just kind of the mechanics of Scrum, and then we're going to introduce the Kanban of the program and portfolio layer after that. So minimally marketable features feed the prioritization within our sprint planning. So we take the most important stuff, we move it in. Right, all Scrum stuff, we break it down into tasks. Maybe if your team's doing that, we break it down into, we estimate in hours, we move it across the board, all that kind of stuff, okay? All the same basic team stuff. We do, maybe sprint burn downs, we do velocity trends, we do release burn downs. What we basically know is at the end of the sprint that the team has completed the highest priority user stories against the highest priority features against the highest priority epics. Everyone's focused on delivering value early and often. So as you're introducing this into an organization, you teach these concepts. You roll this out across multiple teams, so every team kind of has a view of how they map into value. Maybe at the epic and feature level, it's actually the same map, and at the user story, it's very different. Every team has the ability to track and plan throughout the sprint. Every team has consistent metrics. We establish that base of the Agile enterprise, which is fundamentally the team. But now what we want to do is say, okay, now we want to establish the relationship between team-level velocity and enterprise-level flow of value. This is the key. So team predictability is one thing, but organizations need to be able to track the value at the epic level, those highest level of bubbles on my earlier diagram. We need a mechanism to ensure that features that span multiple Scrum teams are treated with the same sense of awareness and urgency even as single product features. And all of our day-to-day activities need to clearly map to enterprise objectives. We need to build the product as one organization. So the way I bring this all together is that we talk about the idea of kind of a three-tier system. So at the bottom, Tier 1 Scrum, that's the stuff that we're all pretty much familiar with. What we'll do is put a layer, put a layer above that. Now, in this particular case, I chose just to be a tad provocative, analysis, design, build, test, and deploy. Because from maybe a feature perspective, we have some certain things that are going through a period of discovery. We don't know exactly what's in them. Then a period at which we're building them, and a period at which we're integrating and testing them, and then ultimately deploying them out to a customer. So I'm just going to put that on there, okay? At the top layer, I chose to put the RUP phases on. So inception, elaboration, construction, transition. And if you guys haven't worked in RUP in a while, really what those phases are, the only thing they do is they show what is the risk associated with the project. So things that are in inception, we're trying to figure out if, do we even have a solution that can be delivered within the time and cost constraints? In elaboration, are we reducing our technical risk? construction, we're dealing with logistical issues of velocity and team membership, and are we able to get done on kind of the high-level time frame that we're looking for. In transition, are we rolling this stuff out to customers? And so what we do by wrapping Scrum in a Kanban is that we create a pull system across the entire portfolio that is limited by your actual capacity. So down here at the bottom, the teams have velocity that help tell us the rate at which we can drop stuff into their backlog. The middle here, I'm going to demonstrate kind of through a little animation kind of how stuff pulls across that, and then how stuff pulls across that based on the velocity of the team. So let's look at that. So the idea here is that strategically in your organization, you have a visualization of how you move initiatives through the system. And I like the RUP phases. You could have a series of M gates or toll gates or whatever. It doesn't necessarily matter at this level, because all we're really trying to do is establish some language for seeing where things are at in their various states. And so the epic could move into elaboration in this particular case. That drops some high-level features down into an analysis phase or in a design phase. That process drops spikes down into a given team's backlog. Those spikes result in user stories. Those user stories get tasked, and then as the machine rolls, the Scrum teams are delivering, establishing a stable velocity. And at the Scrum team level, I'm talking about we could have marketing teams, we could have sales teams, we could have support teams. There's all kinds of different things that we can have down at the Scrum level, and their backlogs are being coordinated and throttled by these two higher level constructs. So you see what happens is, if you guys are familiar with Kanban, we put work and process limits across the top of some of these columns that forces us to pull things across the board and enables us to very visually see when things are blocked. Now here's the kicker, and this is kind of it kind of gets into the whole theory of constraints play behind Kanban. I'm very aware of the fact that I'm running out of time here with you guys, so bear with me. So what will start to happen is, as this system starts to fill up, and as we're getting a continuous flow of epics across the top board, as we're getting a continuous flow of features across the middle board, as we're establishing stable velocity, if any one of our Scrum teams and our many-to-many relationships becomes a bottleneck, that very clearly is going to put a feature into a blocked state. And then if the feature stays in a blocked state long enough, it prevents other features from moving into that state and ultimately creates a stop the line kind of condition within our overall system. Now the discipline is that when you have a bottleneck within your system, there's only certain things that you can do with it. You can elevate it in the sense that maybe we give it more resources. We can subordinate it in the sense that we make everybody else go slower to balance to the constraint, or we can exploit it in the sense that we take everything off of it to be able to make it go as fast as possible. And kind of the metaphor here at the team level is, if I have developers and testers in an Agile team, and the testers are constrained, it's very common for the developers to want to keep writing code that can't be tested by the QA team. And so in Scrum, we kind of enforce that by this definition of done, done. Well, what we're saying now is that at the higher levels, at the feature and epic levels, if a feature is blocked because of the performance of one team rather than individual or a role, now what we have is a condition where that team is the bottleneck, and what we have to do is we have to be able to either subordinate, elevate, or exploit that particular constraint. Okay? So then what we end up with is, as we're managing the system, we're constantly paying attention to which teams are the constrained resource. We're limiting the amount of work that can go into the front of the queue by virtue of how it's flowing through the system. We understand the performance of the elements within the system because they have velocity, and we can apply impediment removal or whatever to help that velocity stabilize or potentially even increase. So at the team level, we've got these velocity metrics that drive predictability. Excuse me, I can't seem to work my computer today. At the program and product level, we start maybe looking at some lean metrics, right? So we look at maybe the average cycle time, or the amount of time things were in queue, or the rate at which things move from queue. We can set policies in terms of what it means to move from place to place. And at the enterprise level, lean metrics kind of apply too. So what we're really trying to instill in these companies that are going down this path is a mindset end-to-end that we value team-level agility. We value the cultural aspects of Agile at the team level, recognizing, though, that it requires more mature, maybe is the word I'm looking for, constructs above us to be able to make sure that we're consistently getting value at the epic and the feature level out of the system. And it does. It asks us, this model asks us to kind of reevaluate how we do, how we look at the organization. If a team's struggling, we've got to figure out how to help that team go faster or subordinate the rest of the system to it. So anyway, that was, again, right, days worth of material and a very fast 40-45 minute talk. I hope that this was at least educational in the sense that you guys understand that there's a pattern out there, and you're starting to see people talk about this stuff. I'm not the only person out there, so do some research on this kind of stuff. You might look at like expanding class Kanban as a pattern. You might look at some of what like Dean Leffingwell's doing with his big picture. That often gets implemented this way, but it's definitely a way of getting the value that you guys are investing in at the Scrum team level, getting that visible and making sure that those Scrum teams are working on the right things at the right time so we can get value out of the system early. So with that, I'm gonna stop talking and give the horn back to our moderator and see if you guys have any questions.
All right, we have a lot of questions, so I'm just going to go through them in order for you, Mike.
Okay.
Starting with Amy. How would you show external suppliers a holiday period in your Scrum?
How would you show it in the Scrum? Well, I don't know that I would necessarily show it in the Scrum. How that would probably manifest itself is it might be a column in maybe the product level Kanban where you have a dependency on an external supplier, and as that feature gets decomposed, certain things go over into that supplier, and if they're not able to deliver within a certain period of time, then that becomes in a block state, and it prevents the other things from going. The key thing that we want to try to do to kind of extend what I was talking about is if the supplier's not delivering, like they have a critical part, might be analogous to if I had a transmission supplier when I was building cars. If I run out of transmissions, I don't keep building cars that are just missing transmissions and then hope to retrofit them in later, right? I stop building cars for a little while, wait for the transmissions to catch up, and then move along. So in an external supplier, you just have to figure out where they fit in the value chain and what's the best place to model them in the Kanban, and then they would probably get their own node potentially, depending on the organization.
Okay, next question is about, it's long, sorry. So
okay.
Basically, how do we plan for kind of the enterprise Scrum in order to create common understanding of business objectives?
Yeah.
And we like this question since it also includes how each team wants their different tools and different approaches.
Yeah, well, so a couple of things. So first of all, that's a very, very hard problem to solve. You've got to have a pretty significant amount of just kind of senior leadership buy-in to be able to get the organization to manage this way. And even once you have it, it's still really hard because a lot of times we've got so much pressure to produce, whether it be from our sales cycle or what have you, or just market pressures in general, that getting very specific about what it is we want to do and aligning the high-level things that we're going to bring into our portfolio with strategy and making good decisions that are limited by capacity, all of that stuff is just difficult, right? And at each of those top two layers, just in really just honest practicality, in some of these organizations, you just start establishing meetings to work this stuff out. And I don't mean like meetings that are really dry and everybody just kind of comes in. I'm really talking about working meetings where, the execs are taking the vision and the investment themes and they're translating them into these investment increments, and I'm calling epics, and product councils that are working to take those investment increments and decompose them into features and user stories that ultimately feed the teams, and visualizing this stuff on the board. Very, very challenging. It's a solvable problem, but it just requires a ton of hard work. I made a note to write a blog today about just the hard work of breaking things down and aligning what we're doing. It's like bridging strategy and execution, and people write books about this even outside the Agile world of bridging strategy to execution. I want to talk about the tooling and the stuff at the team level. So this is the one thing that I think is interesting about Agile in the enterprise, right, or when we're talking about enterprise agility. So we tend to, at the team level, when we talk about team level Agile, one of the big sells is, hey, we're Agile, we're self-organizing, we're self-directing, we get to do kind of whatever we want. And maybe that's too extreme, but there's a certain amount of freedom. Choose your tools, choose your methods, choose your process, whatever works. I think in an Agile enterprise, I think that there is room for a series of minimally constricting restraints. So if it makes sense to let the tool or let the team use a tool that is of their choice, that's great. But if there is some pressing value to have some sort of universal build system or universal source control or universal project management tool, something like that, I think it's fair in an organization where we are all interdependent that there is some agreement. Again, you might want to have a working committee. You want to balance the need for authorizing people to make these kinds of decisions with the greater good and the ability of the organization to operate as a whole. So no easy answers there, but I guess I just go down that path to say that I think it's reasonable to put a certain amount of limitation on the team.
Okay. Next, do the Kanban team members need to be totally separate people from those on the Scrum team or the other Kanban level?
No. I usually when I map this out for an organization, I find that there's some degree of overlap. Just really practical in a couple of organizations that I'm in right now. You can just imagine, and I'll try to do this without a visual, but 4 or 5 Scrum teams operating Scrum, all that kind of stuff that we talk about, and then create some sort of product owner team construct. And typically that's made up of like some product managers, maybe some business analysis architects, that kind of a thing. And ideally, those people have a role in the various teams, and maybe even dedicated into those teams, because we don't want this middle tier to be an ivory tower. I've got another diagram. I did a paper for the Cutter Consortium talking about rethinking the Agile enterprise, and I show this diagram of kind of constraints and boundaries. That middle team is really establishing a set of constraints or boundaries for the Scrum team. They're really functioning as a product owner. The product owner comes with the what we're going to build, the business priority. They might even come with some, hey, we're going to invest in this kind of technology, not, right? There's lots of things that kind of middle tier does. But fundamentally, their responsibility is to make sure that all 4 of those teams have a backlog that is focused on delivering the highest priority features and the highest priority epics first in these little small batches. So yeah, so I guess I can say the ideal situation is for there to be overlap and for those people in the various tiers to have a role in the tier at least below them, if not above them. But they're just working groups, right? They're just working groups. That middle tier is doing the role of a product owner in a large, complex enterprise where lots of perspectives have to be taken into consideration.
Okay, so last question, building on that constraint concept. In the tier 2, doesn't that imply that each Kanban step has a separate team? Otherwise, couldn't it constrain the workflow of the Scrum teams in tier 3?
Yeah, absolutely. So it just depends upon the construct of your organization. So like the 2 that I'm actively working with now, we've got a top tier Kanban. One of the organizations has a single middle tier Kanban, but as we scale into more teams within this organization, the next batch of teams that we pull in is going to have its own middle tier Kanban, and then the top tier Kanban is going to be what unifies them. Different organization, much smaller, has about 7 Scrum teams, and they have like a product owner team kind of in the middle that's playing this middle role, and then they have a single strategy board. So it can be one to many, or it can be one to many. There's just lots of different patterns depending upon the needs of the organization, but they all pretty much follow this same similar reference architecture. And like I said, the reason why this isn't like a formulaic thing, and a lot of this stuff is still largely getting figured out into how to implement how the best way. But again, I think what we're discovering is a pattern, that is starting to gain mind share. It works. I can absolutely tell you that it works. And kind of almost give everybody permission to say, hey, think in this direction, and there are solutions to problems that you're having that you might not have thought about before. And then what you got to do is just take all these little bits that I've told you and figure out how to apply them in your organization.
All right, Mike, well, I think that does it. I want to thank everyone for their time today. I especially want to thank Mike Kottmeyer for this incredible presentation on blending Scrum and Kanban to create an end-to-end Agile enterprise. A recording of the presentation will be sent out to everyone following, as well as information on how to receive your PDUs. We look forward to seeing you at our next Agile Live webinar.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you joining us.